The funeral had been 3 days ago, and Josie Calloway still hadn't figured out what to do with the quiet. Bell Hollow, Kentucky, did not have much of it under normal circumstances. There was always a tractor somewhere, or a dog, or her grandfather's ancient radio muttering, whether reports from the kitchen counter at a volume he refused to lower no matter how many times she told him he was going deaf in one ear. But the radio had been off since Tuesday, and the tractor sat cold in the equipment shed. And the dog, an elderly blue heeler named Miner who had outlived 2 owners' worth of grief already, followed Josie from room to room of the farmhouse like he expected Elias Calloway to walk back in through the kitchen door any minute and ask what everybody was standing around for. The service itself had been small, the way he'd asked for it to be, a graveside prayer, no long sermon, a folding chair set up for his one surviving army buddy, a man named Purcell who was 91 and cried without making a sound, tears just running down into the collar of a dress shirt that had clearly not been worn since some other funeral a decade back. Josie had watched Purcell the whole time out of the corner of her eye, because there was something in the way he stood at the edge of the grave, not quite with the family, not quite apart from it either, that had bothered her without her being able to say why. When she'd gone to thank him afterward for coming all the way from Somerset on a bad hip, he had taken her hand in both of his and held it a beat too long. "Your grandpa," Purcell said, in the rasping half-whisper of a man who'd smoked 2 packs a day for 50 years and quit too late to save his voice, kept more secrets than any man I ever served beside, and I served beside some real quiet ones. Don't go digging unless you're ready to keep digging. That's the only advice I've got, and I hope to God you never need it. She had laughed it off at the time, assumed it was some half-remembered army story about black market cigarettes or a court-martial nobody talked about anymore, the kind of thing old veterans hinted at because the hinting was more interesting than whatever the actual answer turned out to be. She had not thought about it again until 3 days later, kneeling on her grandfather's bedroom floor with a dresser drawer stuck halfway open on its runners, and by then it was already too late to unhear it. She was 24 years old, and she had, over the past 3 days, personally organized more sympathy casseroles than she had cooked real meals in her adult life, and somewhere in the blur of it she had stopped being a granddaughter and started being an executor, which was a much colder job that nobody warned you came bundled with the first one. Cousins to hug. A will to locate, eventually, in a filing cabinet at a lawyer's office in Somerset that hadn't updated its letterhead since the Reagan administration. A dog to feed, twice a day, on a schedule Miner enforced with the quiet tyranny of an old animal who had learned that grief made humans forget things that mattered. Today was the first day nobody needed anything from her, which meant today was the day she finally had to go through his dresser. She started with the top drawer because it seemed like the safest one: undershirts, a comb, a church bulletin from some Sunday 2 months back that he'd apparently used as a bookmark and then forgotten to return to any book. The second drawer had socks and a cigar box of fishing lures that smelled like WD-40 and 40 years of lake water. It was the third drawer, the deep one, the one that stuck a little on its runners the way it always had for as long as she could remember, that had the watch. She almost missed it. It was wrapped in a handkerchief at the very back, behind a stack of manila envelopes she assumed were tax records, and when she unwrapped it, she sat back on her heels on the bedroom floor and just looked at it for a while. It was a pocket watch, or something built to the general shape of one, heavier than it looked, warm brass on the color of an old penny, with a case back engraved in a pattern she didn't recognize at first glance. 3 interlocking rings around a tight spiral, worn soft at the edges from decades of thumbs. There was no chain. There was no maker's mark that she could find, no brand stamped anywhere on the case, which struck her as strange for something clearly old and clearly well cared for. When she pressed the little stem on top, the case opened on a hinge so smooth it felt oiled yesterday, and inside there was a face with no numbers on it at all, just 3 thin hands, moving at speeds that didn't match any clock she'd ever owned, and a small circle of pale light at the center that pulsed, slow and steady, like something breathing. She had never seen it before in her life. And she had visited this house every summer of her childhood and every other weekend since she'd gotten her license, had watched her grandfather do the exact same small ritual every single morning she'd ever slept under his roof. Up before dawn, coffee on. And then, standing at the kitchen window with his back to the room, taking something out of his shirt pocket, winding it with 3 careful turns of a small key he kept on his belt, holding it to his ear for a second like he was listening for something and putting it away again. She'd asked him about it once when she was maybe 9, and he'd said, without turning around, "Just an old habit, Joe Bird. Keeps things running on time." And something in the flatness of his voice had told her, even at 9, not to ask twice. Another time, when she was maybe 15 and going through a phase of resenting every unexplained rule in her life, she pushed harder, asked why he never once, not on Christmas, not on a hospital morning when her grandmother was dying 2 counties over, skipped that 30 seconds at the window, and he'd looked at her with an expression she had never fully understood until much later, something between exhaustion and tenderness, and said only, "Because some promises don't get to have exceptions. Joe Bird, that's what makes them promises instead of habits." She'd assumed all these years that it was a regular watch, a keepsake from the war maybe, something sentimental and unremarkable. She had genuinely never once wondered what it looked like up close. Minor, curled at the foot of the bed, lifted his head and made a low sound in his throat that wasn't quite a growl, and Josie realized her hands were shaking slightly, not from anything she could name yet, just the ordinary vertigo of finding out a person you loved for 24 years had kept one more room in himself locked than you knew about. She closed the watch and did not put it back in the drawer. That night, unable to sleep, she found herself standing at the same kitchen window her grandfather had stood at 10,000 mornings of her life, watch in hand, doing something she would not, if asked, have been able to fully explain. She wound it. 3 turns, the way she'd watched him do it since before she could talk. There was no key on her belt, but the stem turned anyway, easily, like it had been waiting for a hand instead of a specific tool. She held it to her ear, the way he always had, and heard nothing but the small mechanical tick of gears. And then, so faint she thought at first she'd imagined it, a second sound underneath the first, low and resonant, like a held breath finally let go somewhere very far away. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself a lot of things that week that turned out not to be true. Priya Ose showed up 2 mornings later with a thermos of good coffee, and the specific look on her face that meant she'd decided Josie had spent enough time alone in a dead man's house, and was not leaving until that had been corrected. "You look like hell," Priya said, by way of greeting, letting herself in through the unlocked kitchen door the way she'd been doing since they were both 19 and working the overnight shift together at the Somerset Animal Clinic. "Sit down. Drink this. Tell me what's in the folder." The folder was on the kitchen table, where Josie had left it after her 3rd attempt that week to make sense of it. A thick stack of paperwork from a company called Whitlock Realty Group that had apparently been trying to buy the back 40 acres of the Calloway land for going on 6 years. First from her grandfather now, per the most recent letter dated 4 days after his death with an efficiency that turned Josie's stomach, from his estate. "Developers," Josie said, sliding it across. "They want the back pasture, the one past the tree line down by the root cellar. Grandpa turned them down every single time, apparently. There's a whole paper trail. Never explained why. Just wrote 'not for sale' on the offer letters and mailed them back." Priya flipped through it, frowning. 6 years is a long time to keep saying no to money for scrub land nobody farms. And look at this. The offer's gone up 4 times since the first letter. Whoever's behind Whitlock Realty really wants that specific parcel. Not the good bottomland along the creek, just the 40 acres past the tree line. She tapped a line on the most recent letter. There's a line in here about expedited environmental assessment access. That's not normal language for a housing developer, Joe. That's language for somebody who already knows there's something on the land worth assessing. I noticed that too. I don't know what to do with it yet. You gonna sell it? Josie looked out the window, toward the tree line, where the land dropped away into a stand of old hickories, and beyond that, the low grass-grown mound that had been the root cellar for as long as she could remember, and that she was fairly sure nobody in the family had actually opened in a decade. I don't know yet, she said, which was true, and also not the thing actually occupying most of her attention that morning. She almost didn't mention the watch. It felt private in a way she couldn't articulate, the kind of thing that stopped being real the moment you said it out loud to someone who hadn't watched an old man do the same 3-second gesture at the same window every morning for 20 years. But Priya had known her grandfather too, had eaten his cooking and laughed at his terrible jokes at a dozen Sunday dinners, and in the end Josie found herself pulling it out of her jacket pocket and setting it on the table between the coffee mugs. Priya went quiet in a way that was unusual for her. She picked it up carefully, turned it over, traced one finger along the engraved rings on the back without opening it. "This isn't a watch," she said finally. "I know it's not. I mean it's not, Joe, look at this." She held it up to the window light, angling it so the engraving caught the sun. "I've seen this pattern before. Not exactly this, but close. There's a display case at the County Historical Society, stuff from some kind of federal salvage operation back in the 50s. Half the placards are redacted. It's this whole weird local legend nobody talks about anymore. My grandmother used to tell a story about lights over the hollow the spring after the big storm, back before my mother was born, and how the government men came through the county that whole summer asking odd questions and paying odd sums for nothing anybody could see the value in. Some of the recovered pieces in that display case have engraving like this. Nobody ever figured out what any of it actually was." Josie felt something settle cold in her stomach, the specific dread of a puzzle piece clicking into a picture she hadn't wanted to see the shape of yet. What kind of salvage operation? "The kind nobody in this county likes to say out loud," Priya said, and did not elaborate further, because at that exact moment a low mechanical hum rolled up out of the ground somewhere past the tree line, rattled every window in the farmhouse for 4 full seconds, and then stopped. Both women sat perfectly still, coffee cups halfway to their mouths, listening to a silence that felt, for the first time in Josie's life, like it was listening back. "We should go look," Priya said, not moving. "We should probably not go look," Josie said, also not moving. In the end they compromised badly by driving into Somerset that same afternoon to the County Historical Society's cramped little annex behind the library, where a volunteer archivist named Dolores, who had clearly been waiting 30 years for somebody under 60 to ask her a real question about the display case in the back room, pulled out a folder of yellowed newspaper clippings and let them read, for 20 long minutes, about a weather balloon recovery operation in the spring of 1953 that had apparently required 3 separate agencies, a temporary military checkpoint on the county road, and according to one furious letter to the editor that Dolores clearly relished sharing, the confiscation of a local farmer's entire wheat crop for testing purposes that was never returned or explained. "Nobody ever found out which farmer," Dolores said, closing the folder with the reverence of someone handling something far more important than paper. "The county's kept a soft spot for a good UFO story ever since, mostly for the tourists. I don't suppose either of you knows anything more than that." She pulled a second folder from a lower drawer before either of them could answer, thinner, older still, its edges gone soft and furred with handling. "This one's my favorite," she said, laying it open with the pride of a woman who had spent 30 years being the only person in the building who cared. Inside was a single grainy photograph, County Fair, summer of 1954 by the date penciled on the back. A crowd gathered around a prize hog pen, and at the very edge of the frame, almost cropped out entirely, a young man in overalls Josie recognized instantly by the set of his shoulders, even 60 years and a full head of hair younger than she'd ever known him. "Elias Calloway," Dolores said, tapping the corner of the photo. "Won best cattle 3 years running around then, if the ribbon count in our old fair records is right. Steadiest hand in the county, folks used to say, though nobody ever explained steady for what exactly. Funny thing to be known for, when you think about it." Josie looked at the photograph for a long moment, at a 23-year-old version of a man she had only ever known gray-haired and slow-moving, standing at the edge of an ordinary summer crowd with a secret already 6 weeks and a lifetime deep inside him, giving away nothing at all to the camera except a small, private, unreadable smile. She did not tell Dolores why her hands had gone still around the folder's edge. Some things she was beginning to understand. A person only got to learn how to carry by carrying them herself first. "No, ma'am," Josie said, and hoped it did not show on her face how badly that was already becoming a lie. The black SUVs came up the gravel drive at 6:40 the following morning, 3 of them in tight formation, throwing dust that hung gold and heavy in the low light, and Josie watched them come from the porch with Minor pressed hard against her leg, growling low and steady in a way he had never once done at a UPS truck or a neighbor's pickup. 6 people got out. 5 wore plain dark suits with no visible insignia, moved with the specific unhurried confidence of people who had done this exact walk up this exact kind of driveway many times before, and did not expect resistance. The 6th, older, silver-haired, wearing a gray overcoat despite the June heat, walked slightly ahead of the rest with the loose-shouldered authority of a man who had stopped needing to raise his voice a long time ago. "Josephine Calloway," he said, close enough now that he didn't need to raise it now either. "Aldous Holt. I'm with a federal interagency office. You won't find it in a phone book, and I'd rather not waste either of our mornings pretending you will. I'm very sorry for your loss. Your grandfather was, by every account I've read, a remarkable man." He said it like a fact filed and closed, not like sympathy. "I need to speak with you about an asset registered to this property." "An asset?" "That's the term of art, yes." Holt's eyes moved briefly, past her shoulder toward the tree line and the low mound beyond it, and something in his face, not quite a flinch, more a recalibration, told Josie he already knew exactly what was down there, had likely known before he ever got in the car. As of 04:30 this morning, a decommissioned monitoring station 40 miles from here logged an active energy signature originating from this property. The last time that signature registered anything above baseline was 1953. "I'd like you to understand that I am taking this seriously enough to be standing on your porch in person, instead of sending a letter, Ms. Calloway, and I would very much appreciate you extending me the same courtesy." "I don't know what you're talking about." "You wound something 2 nights ago," Holt said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "Something your grandfather wound every morning of his adult life without fail, going back to a date that predates your birth by decades. We have a file on this property, Ms. Calloway. It is not a large file, because for 70-odd years there has been nothing in it worth writing down beyond a single line, once a year, confirming continued stability. That line changed 4 days ago. I need to secure the site." Behind him, one of the plain-suited agents was already unrolling a strip of yellow tape from the mailbox post, and another was photographing the tree line with a handheld device that hummed faintly and lit up amber when it swept across the direction of the root cellar. A third had walked, without asking, halfway toward the equipment shed, and Josie felt something in her go sharp and territorial in a way that surprised her with its own intensity. "Get him away from the shed," she said, before she'd fully decided to say it. "You don't have a warrant to search my property. You have some kind of order about an energy reading. Those aren't the same thing, and I might not have gone to law school, but I did watch enough of my grandpa's shows to know that much. Something that might, in a different man, have been the beginning of a smile crossed Holt's face and was gone again just as fast. "You're not wrong," he said, and gestured the agent back with 2 fingers, an economical motion that got instant compliance. "I have an executive order under a statute you have never heard of, covering circumstances the general public is not aware exist, which authorizes me to secure a site presenting an active national security concern, pending judicial review that will not happen in open court, because open court is not equipped to hear this kind of case without causing exactly the kind of panic my office exists to prevent. I am telling you all of this because you strike me as someone who responds better to the truth than to being managed, and I have found, over a long career, that I would rather spend an extra 10 minutes being honest with a frightened 24-year-old than spend the next 6 months cleaning up the mess of having lied to her." "This is my land," Josie said, and heard her own voice come out steadier than she expected, some flat Calloway stubbornness rising up from wherever her grandfather had kept it all those years. "You don't get to just walk out here and tape it off." "I have a federal order that says I do," Holt said. "I would genuinely rather not use it. I would much rather you tell me everything you know about what your grandfather kept in that cellar, so I can make an informed decision instead of a conservative one." He paused, and for just a second something almost human moved behind his professional courtesy. "Conservative decisions on a Category 4 are not gentle, Ms. Calloway. I'd like to avoid needing to make one." "What's a Category 4? Holt studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies a witness he's trying to decide is lying or genuinely in the dark. Whatever he saw settled it. "It means," he said, "that whatever is under that hill has started waking itself up, and that my office has exactly 72 hours to determine whether that is a rescue, a containment, or a threat, before protocol makes the decision for us." He did not explain further, not there, not on the porch with the dog still growling and the tape already going up around her fence line. He simply handed her a card with a phone number on it and no name, told her a car would come for her within the hour to bring her in for a formal interview, and suggested, in the tone of a man who had learned that suggestions worked better than orders on people who still had their pride intact, that she not attempt to remove anything else from the property before then. She did not tell him about the journal she hadn't found yet. She would not have known at that point that there was one to tell him about. They did not arrest her, though for 4 hours at the continuity office's temporary field post, a rented double-wide trailer set up in the gravel lot of a shuttered feed store 2 miles down the county road, which somehow made the whole thing feel simultaneously more sinister and more absurd. It felt close enough to arrest that Josie stopped being able to tell the difference. There were maps on the walls she wasn't supposed to look at, and clearly did anyway, county topography overlaid with concentric rings, radiating out from a point that was, unmistakably, her grandfather's back pasture. There was a woman 2 desks over speaking in low, clipped sentences into a phone about extraction window and airfield ETA that Josie made herself stop listening to, because listening to it made her hands shake in a way that would not help her in the room she was actually in. Holt questioned her himself for the first 90 minutes, methodical and unhurried, working backward through her grandfather's whole life, the way a man builds a house, a stable job, the shape of the tools in the equipment shed, why the Whitlock Realty offers had all been refused, whether her grandfather had ever traveled, ever taken unexplained trips, ever received unusual mail. She answered honestly because she genuinely had no reason yet to do otherwise, and watched him fill in a picture of Elias Calloway that felt, disturbingly, more complete on Holt's legal pad than it had ever felt in Josie's own memory. "He never once told you," Holt said, near the end of it, and it wasn't quite a question. "He told me it was an old habit," Josie said. That's the entire extent of the explanation I ever got in 24 years. That tracks with the pattern, Holt said, mostly to himself, making a note. The keepers we've had contact with over the decades, and there have been others, Ms. Calloway, though very few and none quite like this one, almost never told their families. It's not secrecy for its own sake. It's protection. They understood correctly that the knowing puts a target on a person's back that the not knowing doesn't. Is that what you're doing right now, putting a target on my back? Holt set his pen down and looked at her properly for the first time since the interview began, and for just a moment the professional distance dropped enough that Josie saw, underneath it, something that looked almost like fatigue. I had a keeper once before, early in my career, he said. Different site, different circumstances. A woman in Nebraska who inherited a similar arrangement from an uncle and didn't understand what she had until it was already unstable. I was the field lead on that extraction. It did not go the way the file said it would. I have spent every year since trying to make sure that never happens again on my watch, which sometimes means I come across as a man with no room left in him for anything but procedure. I promise you, Ms. Calloway, that is not the whole truth of me. It is simply the part of me that has kept the most people alive. It was the younger agent, the one who'd introduced herself simply as Ray's while taking Josie's statement afterward, who finally cracked the door open on what was actually happening. Once Holt had stepped out to take a call and left the two of them alone with a folder Josie was fairly sure she wasn't supposed to be looking at, upside down, across the table. He's not wrong to be careful, Camille Reyes said. I've read the incident logs on a real Category 4 escalation, including the Nebraska file he just mentioned. It's not pretty, but I've also read your grandfather's file, Ms. Calloway, and I want to say, off the record, because if Holt hears me say this, he'll rotate me to a desk in Fairbanks. That man is the reason this office has a stable asset protocol at all instead of a burn-it-down one. What do you mean, his file? Reyes hesitated, glanced at the door, and made a decision Josie would later understand had cost her something. She turned the folder around. There wasn't much in it. A single page, typed, decades old by the look of the font, stamped Continuity Office Legacy Asset, Annual Review across the top, with a column of dates running down the left margin. 1954, 1955, 1956, all the way down in an unbroken line to 11 months ago, and beside each date in the same terse hand across 70 years despite obviously being retyped and reissued by different clerks over the decades, the same two words. Stable, warden compliant. Your grandfather signed an intake agreement in the spring of 1953, Reyes said quietly. We don't have the full original. It predates our current archive system by a wide margin, and half of what survived from that era got scanned so badly it's barely legible. But near as anybody's been able to reconstruct, he found something on his own land that our office back then classified as a live threat and wanted to remove by force. He talked them out of it, convinced somebody up the chain that force was the wrong call. And then he spent every single morning for the next 71 years personally keeping it stable instead, on the terms he negotiated, which nobody currently on staff has ever fully understood, because the man who negotiated them died of old age 9 years before I was born. Keeping what stable, Josie said, though some cold, clear part of her had already started assembling the shape of an answer she didn't want. I don't know, Reyes admitted. That's the honest truth. The file says legacy asset, full stop. No further description on record. Whatever it is, your grandfather knew, and he chose, every single morning for 71 years, to keep doing whatever kept it asleep instead of letting my office finish what it started in 1953. She glanced at the door again. Holt's extraction team lands at the Somerset airfield tomorrow at noon. They're trained to secure a Category 4 by removing it to a hardened facility. If it resists removal, or if removal isn't feasible inside the window, protocol authorizes field neutralization instead. I've seen what that word means in an after-action report, Ms. Calloway. It isn't removal. He's going to destroy it. He's going to follow the safest procedure available to him on a 71-year-old case file nobody alive fully understands anymore, because the one person who did understand it just died and left a granddaughter who wound the thing without knowing what she was doing. Reyes closed the folder gently, like she was closing something more than paper. I think you should go home, Miss Calloway, and I think you should read whatever your grandfather left you before tomorrow at noon. Because right now, you're the only person on either side of this who might actually know what he was protecting. There's also a Whitlock Realty file cross-referenced in our system, if it helps to know that a shell entity, 6 years of pressure to buy this exact parcel, ownership records that dead end at a holding company we've traced, informally, to a private group that's been trying to locate Category 4 sites independently of any government for longer than my office would like. I'd get home before dark, if I were you. She found the journal at 2 in the morning, in the equipment shed, inside a tin toolbox welded shut with rust that took her 20 minutes and a crowbar to force, tucked under a false bottom that had clearly been built into the box on purpose, by a man who had understood, even in 1953, that some things needed to survive him without being easy to find. The handwriting was young in the earliest pages, tighter, more careful, a 22-year-old's hand still finding its adult shape, and it told her, over the next 4 hours, everything her grandfather had never once said out loud in 71 years of mornings. He had found the wreck in April of 1953, in the back pasture, 3 days after a storm that had knocked down half the fence line and left the ground scorched in a long, shallow furrow nobody in the county could explain. He'd gone out with the tractor to clear it and found instead a woman. He used that word from the very first page, woman, not creature, not thing, barely alive, burned along one side, speaking in a language that wasn't any language, curled around a piece of wreckage she would not let go of even half conscious. He'd hidden her in the root cellar before anyone else came looking. He'd nursed her through 6 weeks nobody in his family ever knew about, feeding her a story about a bad flu when his own mother asked why the cellar was suddenly locked, sneaking food and water, and eventually, whiskey against fevers he had no other way to treat, sitting up with her through nights when he genuinely believed she would not survive until morning and stayed anyway because, one early entry read, somebody ought to be there when it happens, whoever she is, wherever she's from. Nobody should go that alone if there's a person nearby who can help it. Somewhere in those 6 weeks, once she had enough of his language to explain herself in fragments, he had learned who she was. Her name, as best his young hand could spell it phonetically, was Sora Vantiel. She was, in his words, a healer of some kind, a doctor for whole worlds, not just people. Best I can make it out, from somewhere very far away. And she had been running from her own government, a ruling body he only ever recorded as the Directorate. Because she had refused an order to weaponize research she'd spent her whole life developing to save lives instead. Her ship had been shot down by her own side, rather than let her carry that refusal somewhere they couldn't reach her. She told him, in the last coherent conversation before her injuries finally overtook what her own body could manage without proper care, that survival past this point required a kind of medical sleep her people used for exactly this. A stasis, not death, not quite life either, that could hold her stable through the healing her body couldn't do awake, for as long as it took the world hunting her to stop looking or to fall. She told him how to build what she needed. He built it in the root cellar, alone, over the following winter, with tools and materials that made no sense to him and instructions he copied phonetically into this same journal, because he was terrified of forgetting a single step. He wrote, in a January entry, about digging through frozen ground by lantern light after a full day's farm work, about a component that took him 4 separate attempts to shape correctly out of scavenged truck parts because Sora, drifting in and out of coherence by then, could describe what it needed to do but not, in the language she had, exactly what it needed to look like. And on the morning of March the 3rd, 1954, he sealed her into it, and wound, for the first time, the small device she called an anchor key. The thing Josie now carried, still warm in her jacket pocket. Because it was, Sora had told him, the only part of the system built to answer to a living hand instead of running on its own, a deliberate choice, so that whoever kept her would always be choosing to, every single morning, and never just letting a machine decide for them. I asked her why it had to be a hand and not just a switch. One entry read, in ink gone the particular brown of great age. She said a switch doesn't have to mean it. A hand does. She said her people build their most important promises that way on purpose, so the keeping of them stays a choice every day for as long as the promise lasts. I told her I understood. I don't think I really did, not yet. I understand it a great deal better now, 70 mornings into keeping it. The federal men had come 8 months later, in the fall of that same year, following instrument readings from the construction itself. He had gone out to meet them alone, unarmed, and had somehow. The journal was frustratingly spare on exactly how, talked a colonel and 2 civilian agency men out of digging up the cellar and hauling everything inside it back to a lab. On the strength of one argument he wrote down almost word for word, like he'd wanted to remember exactly what he'd said in case he ever needed to say it again. You can take her out of the ground today and she'll die on the way to wherever you're taking her, because whatever's keeping her alive was built for exactly this hole and nothing else, he'd told them. Or you can let one farmer keep an eye on her for free forever and check on him once a year to make sure he hasn't lost his mind. I'm not asking you to trust her. I'm asking you to let me be the one who's responsible, so that when she's finally safe to wake up, there's somebody who kept a promise instead of a file cabinet. They had taken the deal, apparently more out of Cold War-era pragmatism than kindness. One quietly handled asset was cheaper and safer than the alternative, and nobody wanted a live extraterrestrial casualty on their hands if the removal went wrong. And Elias Calloway had spent every single morning for the next 71 years making sure the file never had to be reopened. There were other entries, scattered across the decades, that Josie made herself read even though every one of them cost her something new. A 1962 entry, terse and frightened, about a near miss during the missile crisis when a nervous colonel had floated the idea of neutralizing every unexplained asset in the eastern half of the country, just in case. And her grandfather had spent 3 sleepless nights half convinced he'd wake to find soldiers on the property before the order was quietly walked back. A 1978 entry about a Whitlock family, an earlier generation of the same name now attached to the realty company chasing her, who had once tried to buy the back parcel directly from him with cash no bank would ever explain, and how he'd turned them down flat and never told anyone why, only written, privately, that some people's noses for buried things were a great deal keener than their consciences. A short, almost embarrassed entry from 1991 admitting that he had, once, in a moment of loneliness after her grandmother's death, sat beside the sealed chamber and talked to Sora for an hour as though she could hear him, and had felt, absurdly, less alone afterward than he had in months. The last entry was dated 11 days before he died. Getting harder to get up before her these mornings, it read, the handwriting shaky now, an old man's hand instead of a young one, but somehow steadier in what it said than it had ever been. Dr. Kepler says my heart's not going to keep doing this much longer, and I believe him more than I've believed most doctors. I don't know how much longer I've got, but I know it isn't 70 more years. I've thought a long time about what happens to Sora when I can't wind her anchor anymore, and I've decided the only honest answer is that it has to be somebody who chooses it the way I did, nobody I order to. Nobody who inherits it like a piece of furniture. Just somebody who picks it up on their own, out of whatever's left of loving me, and keeps going because they decided to. Same as I did at 22 in a cellar with a stranger who trusted me with her whole life. If that's you reading this, Joe Bird, and I think, if it's anybody, it'll be you. I'm not going to tell you what to choose. I'm just going to tell you she's a good woman who never once in 71 years gave me a single reason to regret the choice. Whatever you decide, decide it because it's yours to decide, not because an old dead man asked you to. That's the only part of this I ever really understood. Josie sat on the shed floor until the sky outside went gray with the first edge of dawn, the journal open on her knees, the watch, the anchor key. She made herself think, its actual name warm in her closed hand, and understood with a clarity that felt less like a decision and more like something that had already happened somewhere underneath her without asking permission, exactly what she was going to do at noon tomorrow. Her phone buzzed on the workbench before she'd even fully stood up, a text from a blocked number that could only have been Ray's. Extraction team still on schedule for noon. Nothing's moved up, but nothing's slowed down either. Whatever you're going to do, do it before then. Josie stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling the calm certainty of 4 hours ago tip suddenly into something closer to panic, and made herself breathe the way she talked down panicked owners in the clinic waiting room 100 times a year, in for 4 counts, out for 4 more, until her hands stopped shaking enough to text back a single word, understood and mean it. She thought briefly about calling her mother in Ohio, or her Uncle Dale 2 counties over who had never once in 6 years stopped asking, at every holiday, whether anybody in the family had come to their senses yet about that back parcel. She decided against both. Her mother had left Bell Hollow at 18 and never looked back, and would not understand this any better rested than exhausted. Dale, Josie suspected with a clarity that surprised her, was exactly the kind of Calloway who might have taken a Whitlock offer years ago if the choice had been his to make, and she was not about to hand him a reason to think it still could be. Whatever this was, her grandfather had chosen not to burden the rest of the family with it for 71 years, and some instinct she trusted more than she could explain told her that had been the right call, and that it was hers to keep making now. She fed Minor, made coffee she didn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table with the journal closed in front of her and the anchor key beside it, watching the window go from gray to gold, until the ordinary, animal need to hear one more living voice she trusted before 9 o'clock got the better of her. She got in the truck before sunrise and drove to see Purcell, because some part of her needed to hear whatever he actually knew before she walked back into that trailer, and because his warning at the graveside had been eating at her for 4 days. He answered the door in a bathrobe, unsurprised to see her, as though he'd been half expecting this exact visit since the funeral, and had simply been waiting for her to catch up to the question. "You found it," he said, before she'd said a word. "Found what exactly?" "Whatever it was your grandpa kept out at that place." Purcell shuffled back from the door to let her in, moving slow on the bad hip, and settled into a recliner that had clearly held the shape of him for 20 years. "I don't know the particulars. He never told me the particulars, not once, not even drunk, not even the night his own wife's casket went in the ground, and I sat up with him till 4 in the morning because I figured a man shouldn't be alone on a night like that. But I served with him in Korea, and I knew him the better part of 70 years after that, and I can tell you this much for free. Your grandfather came home from that war a certain kind of tired that a lot of us came home with, and somewhere around 53, 54, that particular tiredness in him just stopped. Like he'd found something worth being tired for instead of just tired from. I asked him about it exactly once, sometime in the 60s, and he told me there were things a man carried that got lighter the day he stopped carrying them alone, and things that got lighter the exact opposite way, by choosing to carry them every single day on purpose instead of setting them down. He said his was the second kind. He never explained further, and I never asked again, because it was clear the asking cost him something. Josie sat down across from him, the anchor key a small steady weight in her jacket pocket. "Did you ever see anything, hear anything?" "Once," Purcell said after a long moment in a voice gone quieter. 1960, maybe 61. I was out at the farm helping him with a fence line that had gone down in a storm, and we worked late past dark, and I heard something coming up out of that low mound past the tree line. Not a sound exactly, more a feeling, the way you feel a truck going by on a highway before you hear it. He saw my face and he just said real calm, "Don't mind that, it's nothing dangerous, I promise you that much." And then he changed the subject to the Reds' pitching rotation and never brought it up again, and I let him because I trusted him more than I trusted my own curiosity. He looked at her now, steady, the tears from the graveside gone, but something just as raw underneath. "Whatever it is, Joe, I don't think it's a threat. I knew that man 60-some years. He would not have spent one single morning of his whole life protecting something that didn't deserve protecting. That's the only thing I know for certain, and I think it's the only thing that matters." She thanked him and hugged him longer than either of them were usually inclined to, and drove back toward the farm with the sun coming up gold over the ridgeline, more certain than she had been in 4 days that whatever choice was waiting for her at noon, it was already, in every way that mattered, made. The extraction convoy arrived at the Somerset airfield on schedule, and Aldous Holt met it on the tarmac with the specific tight-jawed composure of a man who had already, in the last 18 hours, had to explain his situation twice up a chain of command that did not enjoy surprises, because the situation had gotten considerably more complicated overnight in a direction his protocols had no clean box for. At 4 in the morning, a second energy signature had bloomed on every sensor his office owned, not from the ground this time, but from high orbit, descending, broadcasting nothing recognizable as any human transponder code, and moving on a heading that put it directly over Pulaski County within the hour. It did not attempt to hide. That, more than anything else, was what had kept Holt up the rest of the night, making calls nobody at this hour wanted to take, arguing with a regional director in Washington who wanted the extraction accelerated rather than paused, and losing that argument only by the thinnest of margins. On the strength of 30 years of institutional credibility he had built specifically so that, on the one morning he needed it most, someone above him would still take his judgment over the book. It set down just after dawn in the empty pasture half a mile from the Calloway farmhouse, close enough that Josie felt the ground hum through the soles of her boots from the porch, far enough that it took the better part of 20 minutes for anyone to actually reach her on foot, a single figure, walking alone across the wet grass ahead of a small honor escort that held back at a deliberate, careful distance, dressed in a dark uniform trimmed in a color Josie didn't have a name for, carrying no visible weapon and no visible fear either. She stopped 10 feet from the porch steps, and Josie, later, would not be able to say exactly how she knew the woman was in command of whatever had just landed in her grandfather's pasture, except that it was somehow obvious in the same way it had always been obvious which nurse on a busy shift was actually running the floor. "I am Fleet Marshal Orlog Ashendel," the woman said, in English precise enough that it had clearly been learned specifically for this conversation and no other. "I am given to understand this is Elias Calloway's property." "Was," Josie said. "He died 6 days ago." "I'm his granddaughter." Something crossed the marshal's face, not quite grief, something adjacent to it, the particular controlled stillness of someone receiving news they had hoped, against long odds, not to receive. "Then I am sorry," she said, and it did not sound like a formality. "I did not expect to arrive too late to thank him myself. I have imagined this conversation for 11 years, Miss Calloway. In none of the versions I imagined was he already gone." "Thank him for what?" "For Dr. Vantiel's life," Ashendel said, "which your grandfather has been keeping, alone, at considerable personal risk, for 71 years, on the strength of a promise made to a dying stranger he had every reasonable excuse to walk away from instead." She looked past Josie, toward the tree line, toward the low mound that Josie now understood had been the true center of this entire farm for 7 decades without her ever once suspecting it. I served with Sora before any of this happened, Ms. Calloway. We trained together in a different life, on a world she has not seen in 71 years, and I have not stopped hoping to see her return to. When her ship went dark over your world, my government at the time recorded her as destroyed. I did not believe it. I was quietly disciplined for saying so out loud too many times. Something moved behind her composure, brief and unguarded. The directorate that hunted her fell 11 years ago. It took my own office this long to locate her. The search had been quietly abandoned as unsolvable for most of that time, until a signature anomaly from this property reached our monitoring network 4 days ago and gave us, for the first time in over a decade, a location worth investigating. I did not come to take her by force. I came to bring her home, if she still wishes it, and to formally clear a name that has been listed as a fugitive on my people's registry for far longer than it should ever have been. Behind Josie, gravel crunched, and Holt's convoy came up the drive at speed, 3 vehicles this time instead of the original one, and Holt himself got out already talking before his door had fully swung shut. Marshal, or whatever your rank translates to, I have a hardened extraction protocol authorized on this site as of noon today, and I was not informed of any incoming foreign. You were not informed, Ashendel said, without raising her voice at all, because your government and mine have exactly one treaty on record covering circumstances like this one, negotiated in 1954 by a farmer and 2 men who are now both long dead, and its entire operative clause is 4 sentences long. Would you like to hear it, Director Holt, or would you prefer to proceed on the assumption that 71 years of unbroken compliance from this address counts for nothing? Holt's jaw worked once, twice. Whatever he'd expected to be managing this noon, it clearly had not been a Fleet Marshal quoting his own agency's founding treaty back at him on a Kentucky front lawn. Behind him, Josie saw Reyes step down from the second vehicle, hang back near the tape line, and watch the standoff with an expression that was doing very little to hide which side of it she hoped won. I have 72 hours, Holt said, more quietly now, and a protocol that authorizes field neutralization if extraction proves unsafe or infeasible. I also have a regional director in Washington who is one bad phone call away from overruling both of us and sending in a team that does not ask nearly as many questions as I do. I am trying, Marshal, to buy us all more time than my own chain of command wants to give me. I would appreciate it if neither of you made that harder. Then let us make it neither, Ashendel said, and turned, for the first time, fully to Josie. Ms. Calloway, your grandfather's arrangement gave the choice of the Keeper's successor to the Keeper's own judgment, and to no one else's. Director Holt's office confirmed as much themselves, or he would already have removed the anchor key from your custody rather than negotiating on this lawn. Which means whatever else is decided here today, the final choice of whether Sora wakes, and how, belongs to you. Not to my office. Not to his. Josie looked down at her hand, where the watch, the anchor key, had been riding in her jacket pocket since the shed floor at 4 that morning, still warm, still faintly ticking with its 3 mismatched hands and its small, pulsing light. I already made that choice 2 nights ago, she said. I just didn't know it yet. She meant to say more, but movement at the edge of her vision cut her off. 2 of Holt's agents, the same ones who'd unrolled tape from her mailbox post 6 days ago, already jogging past the tree line toward the low mound of the cellar with the particular brisk purpose of people executing a standing order nobody had actually rescinded yet. The noon deadline had not moved. Whatever conversation was happening on the front lawn, Josie understood in one cold instant, had not yet reached the 2 men already halfway to the hatch with a case of equipment between them. She did not think about it, she ran. She reached the ivy-covered fieldstone a full 10 strides ahead of them, planted herself directly over the true mechanism her grandfather had spent a winter building, and did not move. "Ma'am, step back," the lead agent said, not unkindly, the words of a man who had clearly been trained to say them and expected them to work. This site is under federal authorization for immediate securing. No, Josie said. Ma'am, my grandfather stood exactly where I'm standing right now in 1954 and told 2 federal men and a colonel the same word, and it held for 71 years, Josie said, and her voice did not shake, though everything else in her wanted to. You can radio Director Holt and ask him whether that order's still good, or you can go through me. And I promise you one of those options is going to look a great deal worse in whatever report gets written about this morning. The 2 agents exchanged a look, weighing a case of equipment against a young woman who had planted her boots like she intended to grow roots there, and to their credit, chose the radio instead of the second option, exactly as Holt came around the tree line at a dead run with Ashendel a half-step behind him, both of them having clearly heard, at the same moment from 2 very different directions, that the standing order had not yet caught up with the new agreement. "Stand down," Holt bellowed, before either agent had finished keying their radio, and they did immediately, the case of equipment lowering to the grass. He reached the cellar entrance a moment later, breathing hard, and looked at Josie still planted over the hatch like she had not moved an inch and had no plans to. "You could have been hurt," he said, and it came out somewhere between a rebuke and something that sounded, despite him, like respect. "So could she," Josie said, nodding down at the ground beneath her boots. "Somebody had to stand here until you got the message. Might as well be me. It's my family's habit." Holt looked at her for a long moment, then turned to the 2 agents, still frozen at attention. "Go help secure the perimeter," he said. "Nobody comes near this hatch again without my direct word. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." Ashendel, arriving a beat later, looked at the fieldstone and at Josie, and something that was almost a smile moved across her composed features. "Your grandfather taught you well," she said, "for a man who apparently never explained a single thing to you directly." "Some things you don't have to be told," Josie said. "You just have to have watched somebody do them enough mornings in a row." They walked to the cellar together, the 4 of them and no one else, Holt insisted, and Ashendel did not object, that both offices be represented for the waking, a small enough concession that Josie understood without being told, was less about protocol and more about neither side quite trusting the other not to act unilaterally the moment they were alone with what was down there. It was Reyes, breaking from the tape line without asking permission, who caught up to them halfway across the pasture. "Sir, I'd like to be there too," she said to Holt, in a voice that had clearly cost her something to use. Somebody from this office ought to see this go right, for once, instead of just reading about it afterward in a file. Holt looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face, tired and a little proud, in a way he would probably have denied if asked, settled it. "Fine," he said. "But if this goes wrong, Reyes, it's your report to write, not mine." "Understood, sir." The root cellar door. Once Josie finally found the true mechanism under 70 years of ivy and fieldstone camouflage, her grandfather had clearly built to look exactly like every other root cellar door in the county, opened onto a staircase that went down much farther than any root cellar had a right to, into a chamber lined with the same unmarked metal as the watch's case, cool and humming faintly with a light that pulsed everywhere at once, slow, patient, unhurried. Like the whole room was breathing along with the small circle of pale gold at its center. Soravantil lay in a shape at the chamber's heart that was not quite a coffin and not quite a cradle, curled slightly on her side the same way Elia's earliest journal entries had described her curled around the wreckage of her own ship 71 years ago, features pale and still and unmistakably, undeniably alive, chest rising, and falling on a rhythm so slow, it took Josie nearly a full minute to be sure she was seeing it at all. Holt's radio crackled on his shoulder, and he silenced it without answering, his eyes on the chamber, on the mechanism a farmer had built by lantern light out of scavenged truck parts 71 years ago and never once let fail. "This isn't in any manual I've ever read," he said, quietly, mostly to himself. This is somebody's whole life's work, hidden under a hillside, and my office has had a one-line annual report on it for 70 years and never once thought to ask what the line actually meant. The mechanism her grandfather had built into that first terrified winter met the anchor key with a small answering chime the instant Josie stepped close enough, like it had been listening for this exact footstep for 71 years, and had simply been very, very patient about it. Holt's radio crackled again before Josie's hand had fully closed around the key, sharper this time. A different voice than before, clipped, impatient, unmistakably speaking from somewhere much farther away than the pasture outside. "Director Holt, this is Regional. We have eyes on your position via the extraction team's uplink and confirmed unauthorized foreign military presence on a Category 4 site. You are ordered to stand your team down from negotiation and authorize immediate neutralization. That is not a request, Director. Confirm." Holt's face went very still. Beside the tape line above them, Josie could hear, faintly, the sound of engines starting the extraction team, still staged at the pasture's edge, awaiting exactly this word. "Belay that," Holt said into the radio, his voice flat and hard in a way Josie hadn't heard from him yet. "I am on site. I have eyes on the asset. It is not hostile, it is not resisting containment, and the foreign officer present has cited treaty language that predates this office's current charter. I am invoking Field Commander discretion under Continuity Office Statute 9, and I am telling you plainly, Regional, that if that team moves on this position before I release them, I will personally ensure every person in this chamber survives to explain why in front of an oversight committee that has never once heard the word, Nebraska, spoken out loud in an open hearing. Are we clear?" There was a long, ugly pause on the other end, 3 full seconds that felt, to Josie, kneeling beside a woman who had not yet finished the breath that would wake her, like the longest of her entire life. "Clear, Director," the voice said finally, tight with fury it didn't bother hiding. "This is on your file." "Everything's always on my file," Holt said, and clicked the radio off and did not look at it again. He met Ray's eyes across the chamber, found something steadying there, and gave the smallest possible nod toward Josie. "Finish it," he said, "before somebody with less patience than me gets a signal through." "He said it had to be a hand," Josie said, mostly to herself, turning the key over once in her palm before she pressed it into the waiting receiver at the chamber's edge. "Not a switch, a hand, so it stayed a choice." "It always was," Ashendel said quietly beside her. "Every morning, for longer than either of us have been alive to notice." Josie turned the key. 3 turns, the way she'd watched 100,000 mornings of her childhood, the way she'd done it alone in a dark kitchen 2 nights ago without knowing what she was actually doing. And this time the chamber's low patient hum rose and brightened, and the pale gold light at its center swelled up and out until it filled the whole underground room, and Sora Vantil opened her eyes for the first time in 71 years. She did not scream or flail, or do any of the things Josie had half-braced for. She simply breathed, once, deep and slow and clearly deliberate, the specific unhurried breath of someone who had trained for this exact moment for a very long time and intended to meet it steadily, and turned her head, and found Josie's face first among the 4 of them standing over her. "Elias," she said, in a voice rough from decades of disuse, reaching automatically for a face that was not the one she expected and finding, instead, a granddaughter's eyes that carried enough of the same shape in them that Sora's own face crumpled, just slightly, with an understanding that needed no translation in any language. "He's gone," Josie said gently, kneeling down to be level with her. 6 days ago, I'm Josie, his granddaughter. He left it to me, the choosing, I mean. He didn't order me to do it, I chose." Sora's hand, thin and shaking with 71 years of stillness, found Josie's wrist and held it, not with the desperation of someone drowning but with the careful, grateful weight of someone finally allowed to set something down. Then you kept the promise the same way he did, she said, as a gift and not a debt. Her eyes moved past Josie, found Ashendel's uniform, and something in her whole body went still in an entirely different way. Orlog, you came yourself. I have been coming for 11 years, Ashendel said, and her voice, for the first time since she'd crossed the pasture, was not entirely steady. The directorate fell. Your name was cleared 5 years ago, in full, by unanimous vote. The bioweapon program you refused was exposed for exactly the atrocity you called it, and the tribunal that condemned you for refusing it was itself dissolved in disgrace. You are not a fugitive, Sora. You have not been one for 5 years. I only wish I could have told you sooner than a Kentucky root cellar, 71 years too late for the man who kept you alive to hear it. Behind them at the top of the stairs, Aldous Holt stood very still, looking down into a chamber his 71-year-old file had never once described accurately, watching a scene his protocol had genuinely no box for, not a threat, not an unstable asset, not anything that fit cleanly under Category 4 or any category his office had ever written a procedure for, and, to his credit, he did not reach for the radio clip to his shoulder. He simply watched, and after a long moment took a slow breath of his own, and put both hands in his coat pockets, the posture of a man conceding a fact he had not expected to concede this morning. His radio crackled again, more insistently this time, a voice Josie didn't recognize asking for confirmation of extraction status, ready to proceed on his mark. Holt looked at it for a long moment, then keyed it once. Stand down the extraction team, he said. Category 4 reclassification pending. Nobody moves on this site without my direct authorization. That is an order, not a request. He clicked it off before the voice on the other end could argue, and looked back down into the chamber, at a woman breathing on her own for the first time in 71 years, at a granddaughter's hand still wrapped around hers. I'm going to need a great deal of paperwork to close this file honestly, he said, mostly to himself. I'll help you write it, Josie said, climbing back up toward him, if you help me make sure whatever you write doesn't end with anybody in a cage. It took the better part of 2 more months to actually close the file. In the end, meetings Josie sat through in windowless rooms with people who used the word asset. So often it eventually stopped meaning anything, and a formal reclassification hearing that Ashendel herself flew back for, in dress uniform, to testify to a room of skeptical human officials about a treaty older than most of them, and a promise kept by one stubborn Kentucky farmer that had, in the end, done more to keep the peace between 2 entire species than any formal negotiation either side had managed since. The hearing itself was held in a windowless room in a federal building Josie was told, afterward, did not officially exist under the name printed on its own directory board. 7 officials sat behind a long table, none of whom she ever saw again, and asked Ashendel questions with the particular brittle skepticism of people who had spent entire careers being told nothing like this was real, and did not enjoy discovering, this late, that it was. Ashendel answered every one of them without flinching, laid the treaty language on the table in both the original and a certified translation, and when a gray-haired undersecretary near the end asked, not quite politely, why any of this should matter to a room full of people with a country to protect, said only, because a man in this country kept a promise to a stranger for 71 years without once being thanked for it, expecting nothing, telling no one, at real cost to himself, and your entire species survived first contact with mine, specifically, because more of you turned out to be like him than not. I would think that matters to a room full of people trying to decide what kind of species you intend to keep being. Nobody had an answer for that. Reyes told Josie afterward that it was the first time in 6 years she'd seen that particular undersecretary sit down without the last word. The regional director who had ordered the neutralization call never formally apologized, though Reyes reported with evident satisfaction that his division lost the Continuity Office's Kentucky Field Authority to Holt's office entirely by the end of the fiscal quarter, and that Holt's Nebraska comment on the open radio channel had apparently become, within the agency, a small, quietly told cautionary legend all its own. Josie's Uncle Dale drove up from 2 counties over once word of the federal settlement, reached the family grapevine in a heavily redacted, thoroughly confusing form, convinced the government owed the family a fortune for whatever had been sitting under the back pasture all these years, and prepared to say so at volume. Josie let him get most of the way through his speech on the porch steps before she told him flatly that the only thing on offer was a formal designation keeping the land permanently out of any developer's hands, hers included forever, and that if he'd wanted a say in it, he should have asked their grandfather about it sometime in the last 40 years instead of asking her now. Dale left in a huff and did not bring it up again at the next holiday, which Josie counted privately as one of the better outcomes of the whole ordeal. The Whitlock Realty question resolved itself almost as an afterthought once the site's true status became a matter of interagency record. Rays, running the paperwork trail down properly for the first time with the full weight of the office behind her instead of against her, traced the shell company back to a private consortium that had spent decades quietly hunting for uncatalogued Category 4 sites to exploit for reverse engineering profit, men who had smelled, in Bell Hollow's unexplained 70-year silence, exactly the kind of unclaimed windfall Purcell's old joke about noses and buried things had warned her about. Federal seizure of the consortium's records took another 6 weeks and generated, according to Rays, the most satisfying court filing of my entire career. The offers stopped coming. The back pasture stayed exactly what it had always quietly been, guarded ground. Category 4 became, on paper, something else entirely, a designation Rays told her, months later over coffee at the same clinic where she and Priya had once worked overnight shifts together, that the office had genuinely never had to write before. Protected Legacy Asylum, Warden of Record, Josie Calloway, voluntary. Holt signed off on it personally, in the end, with a kind of grudging, professional respect that Josie suspected was the closest the man came to warmth, and told her, on her way out of the final hearing, that her grandfather would have been the first person in 70 years to actually make his job easier instead of harder, and that she appeared to be following faithfully in that particular family tradition. The night before Ashendal's ship departed after the reclassification hearing, she sat with Josie on the farmhouse porch steps for a long time without either of them saying much, watching the pasture go dark by degrees the way it always did, fireflies rising up out of the grass where the extraction team's tape lines had been 6 weeks earlier. "You have questions you haven't asked me," Ashendal said eventually. "I would rather you ask them than carry them." Josie considered that for a moment. What was she like before? You said you trained together. Something eased in Ashendal's shoulders, the particular relief of being asked a question she had been waiting a long time for someone to ask. "Fierce," she said. "Not in the way your language usually means it, not loud, not quick to anger. Fierce the way a held line is fierce." She was the only one of us in our whole cohort who asked, out loud, in front of instructors who did not appreciate being questioned, why the directorate wanted weapons research housed inside a medical program at all. Most of us thought the question was naive. It turned out to be the only intelligent question anyone in that room ever asked, and it cost her everything, eventually, because naive questions asked persistently enough become dangerous ones. She looked out at the dark tree line. When the order came down to convert her research into something that could be deployed against a civilian population, she refused it formally, in writing, through every channel available to her, and when every channel failed, she took the only research data that could not simply be reissued to someone more compliant and left. I helped her plan the route. I did not go with her, because someone needed to stay behind who could keep pushing from the inside, and because I did not believe then that we would both survive if we both ran. her voice, always so carefully even, thinned for just a moment. Her ship went dark over your world 11 months later. I spent the next decade being told, by people I once respected, that I was fortunate she hadn't lived to see what her defiance eventually cost the families of everyone who helped her. I did not believe them. I am glad tonight, sitting on this porch, to have been right not to. Did you ever think about coming to look for her yourself? Before the regime fell, I mean, before it was safe. Every day, Ashendel said simply. I did not, because a search from someone under active directorate suspicion would have led them directly to whatever she'd survived into, if she had survived at all, and I judged, correctly. It turns out that her best chance was for no one to find her until finding her stopped being dangerous. It was not a comfortable choice. It was, I believe, the same kind of choice your grandfather made every single morning for 71 years, the harder, quieter, more patient one, instead of the one that felt better in the moment. She turned to look at Josie directly. I think that is why she trusts you so quickly, if you are wondering, not merely because you are his blood. Because you make the same kind of choices he did, without needing to be taught to, and she has spent her whole life able to recognize that in a person almost on sight. It is, I have come to believe, a rarer thing among any species than either of us would like to admit. Josie didn't have an answer for that, so she let the quiet sit between them instead, comfortable in the way only certain silences ever managed to be, until Miner came and settled his graying head across both their feet at once, as if he too had decided in his own way that this was a good use of an evening. Sora stayed. Not in the cellar, that chamber sat empty now, its purpose finally, fully spent, though Josie kept it clean and dry out of something that felt less like duty and more like respect for the 71 years it had quietly done its job, but in the farmhouse itself, in the spare room that had been Josie's own childhood bedroom on summer visits, healing the rest of the way in daylight instead of stasis, learning a world 71 years further along than the one she'd last seen it. With a patience that reminded Josie, more than once, painfully, gently, of her grandfather's own. She learned to drive on the back roads with Priya laughing in the passenger seat at every wrong side instinct 71-year-old muscle memory kept producing. She sat with Purcell on his porch some afternoons and let him talk about Elias for hours, filling in for him the whole unhurried shape of a man she had only ever known in 6 frightened weeks, and 1 hour of quiet talk beside a sealed chamber that she had, it turned out, heard every word of after all. Ashendel visited when her duties allowed it, twice more that first year, and each time the pasture hummed with the quiet arrival of a ship that no longer had to hide what it was doing there, and each time Miner, who had taken with startling speed to sleeping at the foot of Sora's bed the same way he once had at Elia's, greeted her at the porch steps like an old friend instead of a stranger. It was late that first autumn, at the Somerset Animal Clinic on a night Priya was short-staffed, and Josie had come in to help wrangle a frightened colt with a badly torn foreleg that the on-call vet was fairly certain would need to be put down before morning, that Sora finally, quietly, stopped being merely a guest in Josie's life and started being something else entirely. She had come along without being asked twice, stood at the stall door watching the colt thrash against pain nobody could fully manage with what the clinic had on hand at 11 at night, and said, very simply, I told your grandfather once that I was a doctor for whole worlds, not just people. He liked to tease me that Kentucky was welcome to the practice hours whenever I felt like keeping them. She looked at Josie, asking permission with her eyes the way she still asked permission for almost everything in this new, unfamiliar world, and Josie, after one look at the vet's grim face, nodded once. What Sora did over the next 40 minutes, with nothing but her hands and a low, steady voice, and a kind of focus Josie had no name for, was not medicine exactly, not in any framework the exhausted on-call vet could write up in her notes afterward, but the colt lived, and kept the leg, and the vet, driving home at 2 in the morning, told Priya the whole thing had been the strangest and best night of her career, and she wasn't sure she wanted to know why. Word got around a small county, the way word always does. Sora never advertised what she could do and never charged for it, and turned away exactly as many cases as her still recovering strength allowed her to safely take on. But somewhere in that first year, without either of them quite planning it, the back room of the Calloway farmhouse became a place certain people in Bell Hollow learned to quietly bring the animals, and sometimes the people, that regular medicine had run out of easy answers for. And nobody in the county ever asked too many questions about why the woman with the strange, careful hands never seemed to age the way the rest of them did. Because in a place that had kept one enormous secret patiently for 71 years already, it turned out to be remarkably easy to keep one more. And every morning, before the coffee finished brewing, before the day's first tractor sound rolled up from the equipment shed, Josie stood at the kitchen window her grandfather had stood at for 71 years, and wound the anchor key 3 careful turns. Not because anything down in the cellar needed it anymore, but because Sora had asked her quietly, on one of the first mornings of her new waking life, whether she might keep doing it anyway, just for a while. Just until the habit of being cared for on purpose, every single day, by someone who chose it and did not have to, stopped feeling like something that might be taken away again without warning. Josie understood the request better than she let on. She had learned in one long strange week that some promises were not really about the object doing the keeping at all. They were about the hand. So she kept it, not because anyone made her, because, standing at that window every morning with the sun coming up gold over land her grandfather had guarded quietly for 71 years without a single soul in the county ever knowing what he'd truly given his mornings to, she found that she wanted to. Some mornings now, Sora stood at the window with her, watching the same sunrise from a world that had once tried to kill her for refusing to become a weapon, and said nothing at all because nothing needed saying. The watch ticked its 3 mismatched hands. The coffee finished brewing. And Bell Hollow, Kentucky, went on keeping the quietest, kindest secret it had ever kept, one more ordinary morning at a time.